What happens when you take the amazingly difficult combat of the Dark Souls series, the immersive open world of Skyrim, and then adding great talent like George R.R. Martin and Hidetaka Miyazaki? You get a game that stands out from every other AAA title that has been released in the past few years, and that would ever be released in the coming decade. You get a game that has brought back hope for many players when it comes to the big developer landscape, and you get a game that is liked by almost everyone that has ever picked it up. This is the story of the game that is one of the strongest contenders for Game of the Decade. This is the story of Elden Ring. But first, let's backtrack a bit to the start of this story. Back to the 2010s, where the groundwork for Elden Ring was set up. Early on in the decade, Dark Souls 1 was released on September 22nd, 2011 to critical acclaim. It was soon followed by Dark Souls 2 in 2014, and a final installment being released in 2016 in the form of Dark Souls 3, with both games being commercial successes. Today, the Dark Souls series has a legendary reputation, and for good reason too. It has some of the most challenging but amazing combat in all of gaming, which is made even better by the interesting core mechanics of the game. For example, the bloodstain mechanic, where even if the player dies, they can recover all their items by getting back to the place of their death without dying a second time. It has been praised time and time again by people such as David Craddock of Shack News, saying that the harshest punishment one can receive in a Souls game is not dying once, but twice. Right from the start, it was completely clear that this was not meant to be a game that would be enjoyed by everyone, which wasn't a bad thing when we look up the Dark Souls franchise, and really, at any of the titles in the From Software lineup of games. From Software is the studio behind some of the hardest games in gaming history. It is a studio built on making games that are enjoyed by players looking for a challenge. Though this kind of gaming setup makes it very difficult to compete with a lot of the games that are just more accessible. Consider the Spider-Man franchise, where the first game was released in 2018, and as of now, it has 3 games just like the Dark Souls trilogy. The franchise has sold around 33 million copies all over the world as of the time of writing this, mostly because of just how well known Spider-Man is. Almost anyone can pick up the game and enjoy. On the other hand, the Dark Souls franchise, which was completed in 2016 and had a 7-year head start over the Spider-Man franchise, has sold only 35 million copies worldwide, leaving only a 2 million difference between them. Though it's not like the competition is just between different franchises. Even standalone games like Breath of the Wild alone have sold close to 31 million copies. But that doesn't mean that Dark Souls and From Software games as a whole are not doing well. While Dark Souls never had the biggest fan base, it had one of the most dedicated fan bases. Year after year, From Software sales have continued to grow. Despite having very close sales numbers, Dark Souls is considerably more famous as a video game franchise than Spider-Man, with Dark Souls 1 in particular being regarded as one of the best games ever made. Ultimately, the company has always been well liked by fans and critics alike, and while it wasn't accessible to everyone, it was enjoyed greatly by millions of people worldwide. And that's where we come to Elden Ring, which changed everything for the better. Elden Ring followed a lot of the same journey as other Dark Souls games, and during the 5-year development period between 2017 and its release in 2022, it had so much love put into it. From Software has been famous for their amazing way of using character dialogue and other text to tell an engaging story, and how their worlds often feel very lived in. Elden Ring is no exception, and feels as if the From Software style of storytelling has been more or less perfected in the game, which is in part due to the amazing writing of George R.R. Martin, who was given creative freedom to write about the events before the main story. In an interview with IGN, Miyazaki said he chose to give Martin control over the backstory because of the restrictions From Software's method of storytelling placed on writers. Quote, From Software did not want a linear or story-focused game, and by giving Martin oversight of a backstory with which the player is not directly involved, he could allow Martin to freely design his contributions. What that meant is that Miyazaki understood that his team was best at creating a story that is explained poorly, through the dialogue and flavored text as it is in all From Software games. On the other hand, George R.R. Martin was amazing at creating an interesting world for the players to slowly know more about in a linear way. The reason the world of Elden Ring feels so lived in and perfectly made is because of how well these two writing styles mesh together, in the form of a linear backstory and a poorly explained main story. Instead of being a more linear game where you can explore areas one by one, Elden Ring is an open world title. At first, that change might sound pretty small, but that very change is what has led to this surge in popularity, and is the key to why Elden Ring is so popular. As I mentioned before, Dark Souls games have always had a problem with accessibility. Many people would find even the easiest Dark Souls a challenge, and most gamers just don't enjoy fighting a boss for hours and hours until they finally beat it. This accessibility factor is what has been keeping Dark Souls from exploding in popularity for so long. But Elden Ring didn't just solve this problem, it capitalized on it. Not only was Elden Ring a better game in terms of design and story than other Dark Souls games, it was completely accessible. Since the entire game was in an open world, if you came up against a boss that just seemed impossible, you could just leave it, explore someplace else, find a cool new item which helps you get strong enough to go back and beat the boss first try. Elden Ring, much like many of the other games I have mentioned, can be picked up by even the most casual players who would still enjoy it. Elden Ring caters to a broad audience, but that doesn't mean that it's a watered-down version of a set of core mechanics that are used by just about everyone in the AAA developer scene. Instead, From Software has completely innovated on the idea of catering to everyone by making a game that not only allows but incentivizes different playstyles. For all the Dark Souls fans, they can still dodge roll endlessly and get a few hits until they win. But newer players who might not have as good as reflexes can just make a good magic build and destroy enemies from afar. And if you decide to search on Google, you'll find hundreds of powerful builds you can pick from. There's truly something for everyone in the game, and almost every player who picks it up will enjoy it for hours on end. So that's exactly what happened. From Software was always a developer of hit titles, and so, since day one, they had a good number of people wanting to play the game. Not only that, but a lot of big streamers also picked up the game and played it in front of thousands of viewers. Until eventually, through word of mouth, the game just about exploded in popularity. And within 2 weeks, it had over 12 million copies sold, a number on pace with games like GTA 5, getting up to 23 million in 2 years as of the time of writing this. But that doesn't mean its popularity has decreased at all, and it is talked about time and time again as one of the best games released in the past few years. In 2 months' time, on June 21st, 2024, the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC of Elden Ring will be released, something which the developers have been working on for nearly 2 years now. Considering how well Elden Ring was received and just how much From Software has perfected their design, it would be a foregone conclusion that the DLC will perform well, and would almost definitely have millions of sales. And that's where we stand. Elden Ring is the culmination of decades of games, each one getting better than the last. When you consider the amazing writing of George R.R. Martin and the directing of Miyazaki, the professional team of From Software Studios, the amazing design philosophy of Souls games that has worked with their fanbase time and time again, and finally, making it accessible and easy to get into for millions of players, you get a game that can stand the test of time. No matter how many tough bosses it has, the most difficult boss any game can face is time. But if there's anything From Software and the Souls games have taught us, any boss can be beaten with enough attempts and a clear strategy. And maybe Elden Ring is the attempt that wins, not just as the best Souls game, but as one of the best games of all time. Thank you all so much for the constant support and 1,000 subscribers. We have a lot of great videos lined up for you. Until then, consider subscribing to help us reach our goal of 1,500, and if you want to hear the story of the surprising revival of multiverses, watch this next.